Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to this regularly scheduled meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, May 8th, 2018. I'm going to open the meeting at 7:30. Can we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May I have a roll call, please?
Mr. Kucera?
Here.
Ms. Fenton?
Here.
Mr. Jacobson?
Here.
Mr. Adia?
Here.
Mr. McHale?
Here.
Ms. Prowse?
Here.
Ms. Scripture? Mr. Shepard?
Here.
Mr. Watson?
Okay. Item agenda number 4 is the approval of the regular minutes for the meeting from April 24th.
I'll make a motion that we approve the meeting minutes from the regular Planning Commission for April 24th, 2018.
Support.
I have a motion, I have support. Any changes, deletions, corrections? Seeing none, roll call, please.
Ms. Fenton?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Adia?
Yes.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Ms. Prowse?
Yes.
Mr. Shepard?
Yes.
Did I not vote?
Mr. Shepard?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Kucera.
I would have said yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you.
You're not me.
Okay, item agenda number 5 is consideration of a site plan approval for 250 East 14 Mile. It's the proposed House of Optical in the City Center District. Mr. Elliott?
Good evening. So this formerly was the home of Discount Fabrics, as most of you know, and trading places here along 14 Mile Road. So we had an earlier look at this. We had a pre-development meeting with the applicant as well, and now it's coming before you for the first time for formal review. As you mentioned, this is in the city center district. It's not an area that's intended to remain city center district. When the downtown zoning district amendments are fully implemented, it's supposed to be the central mixed district in the future. But currently it is zoned city center district, so that's how we've reviewed it. They're not proposing any new construction. They're proposing to reoccupy the existing building, but there was not a site plan on file for this site, so site plan review was required. The site is 0.58 acres. The building is 3,993 square feet. If you look at your site plan, you can see that the west line of the site is actually coterminous with the west line of the building. So the site is kind of the building east over to the parking area that's adjacent to Old Port Inn. So the use is, I would say mostly retail. I think they may do eye exams as well there. The parking requirements are the same for those, and they're both permitted uses in the zoning district. In terms of vehicle access and driveways, this area is part of the Pear Renshaw shared parking agreement that was entered into by all the property owners between, as the name would imply, Renshaw and Pear along this side of 14 Mile Road, which provides for them to share common parking in general in that area. There are some spaces that are marked exclusively for certain of the members, but in general, the idea is for all those in there to share common parking areas. So there were 2 phases to that agreement. The first phase involved participation by the city and essentially created the on-street parking that's along that side of 14 Mile and limited the access points to those which exist today. So there were formerly more access points on 14 Mile, and those were reduced through the Phase 1 improvements. The agreement contemplates future improvements that would be shared by all the members together. That is, we didn't really try to go into what might be possible through that mechanism as part of our review. I looked at it as what is appropriate for this particular site, the owned property, as portrayed on the site plan. But I did look to the exhibits to the shared parking agreement in evaluating that, and that comes in later as we talk about the parking layout and design. In fact, and also as we talk about pedestrian access, which is the next item on the report. So the site is surrounded by public sidewalks, but internally there's only a sidewalk in front of the building. Unfortunately, it was not attached originally to my report, but I distributed it with an addendum to the packet, and you should have gotten it tonight. Exhibit E to the shared parking agreement, and this is an agreement that was recorded against the real estate and runs with the land, shows what was contemplated by the city engineers at the time that was developed. And so you can see the building in the center of that drawing, and the hatched areas surrounding it are the common parking areas. And then you see that what was envisioned were areas where there, in lieu of bumper blocks to protect the building, there would have been sidewalks, and at the corners there would have been landscaped islands to define the ends of the parking bays on either side of the building. Now, as I say, I did not contemplate what that might mean for the side of the building that is not part of this site, right, the west side of the building. But on the east side of the building, what it would indicate, as I understand it, would be a walk along the east side of the building. That would want to be a 7-foot wide sidewalk because the cars will overhang it by 2 feet, and then terminating in a landscaped island at the northeast corner of the building. You can see that it would involve, well, we'll talk about the rest of it when we get on to parking, but in terms of pedestrian circulation within the site, that would provide a place for folks utilizing the parking, the off-street parking that is on this site, to be able to access the entry, which is on the north side of the building. So then the next area to discuss is off-street parking layout and design. And as I started to mention, the SPA agreement and just general good design practices would suggest that the parking bays should end in landscaped islands. The opportunities for that are limited because, as I say, most of, one side of this building is not part of the site. But on the east side, at the northeast corner, I think that would be appropriate and in lieu of what they've shown, which is pavement markings and a planter box. I think it would be appropriate at the northwest corner as well. I don't think it is appropriate to put a planter box out in the midst of pavement striping without being protected by curbing. But that would be, if you will, a SPA improvement, right, that the group would have to take up commonly. And it might be something that they would want to meet with that group and discuss, but I don't think it's part of the scope of what we should be reviewing here tonight. There was an island shown, as you can see on the drawing, also then at the south end of that bay of parking behind the building, but it doesn't really work because the dumpster enclosure is right there, and so if we were to construct that island, you wouldn't be able to service the dumpster enclosure. So I am not recommending that that one be constructed. But I am recommending that one be created at the northeast corner of the building, and that should include appropriate landscaping in it as well. The loading area on the site is behind the building, kind of off the southwest corner of the building, and that seems appropriate. I have no issues with that. In terms of landscaping and screening, besides providing for landscaping in the islands that I think should be created, this being the city center district, as we've discovered with some other sites recently, when parking abuts 14 Mile Road, it's supposed to be separated from 14 Mile Road by either a knee wall or a hedge with a rail or ornamental fence, and that is not proposed. So that would be required. It's not really something that the Planning Commission can waive. I don't know that it makes sense to do it through the extent of this site, but that's probably a variance they're going to have to seek if they don't want to do it. You know, given the boundaries of their site, you would end up with something that would be of no, it would look odd, right? Because it would terminate in the middle of nowhere, in essence. And so I'm not recommending it, but I'm pointing out that it's a requirement of the city center district now. We've required it of others, and so I think they need to go through the proper procedure to have it waived if that is something that could be justified to the zoning board of appeals.
Could you explain that procedure?
The zoning board of appeals, they would seek a variance based on the site conditions. They have indicated in their follow-up correspondence, and I assume their representative will describe it for you tonight, that it's practically difficult to build it there. There really isn't a place outside of the public right-of-way that is very appropriate for it, and I don't disagree with that, so I think that could be justified. The screen wall they have subsequently in the back along the residential properties, they have subsequently identified as being 6 feet high, so that is in conformance. Number 7, architecture. They provided you with photographs of what the building looks like right now. They're not proposing any changes to that other than the addition of a mural on the west side of the building, I believe it was. That is something that you can approve, and only you can approve pursuant to Section 3610 of the City Code. And so you should review that as part of this application. And if you find the mural to be acceptable to you, then it would be deemed to be approved as part of the site plan approval. Everyone is familiar with what the mural is going to look like because everyone's seen the existing mural on their existing facility, and so I think you have an ability to understand what that would look like. Trash removal is a shared trash enclosure that we just discussed at the back of the property. That is a common area within the shared parking area. So signage is another problematic area because this is a city center district and yet the building sits back in a way that is not contemplated by the city center district regulations. They have a what I would call a short pole sign, right? It's conforming to ground sign height, but it's on a pole. In any event, there are both no pole signs allowed any longer under the city code, and there are no freestanding signs allowed in the city center district now that you've amended those regulations. And so what the regulations would contemplate is that they use a wall sign. If they don't want to use a wall sign because of the distance that the building is set back from the right-of-way, then they will need to make their case to the Zoning Board of Appeals about that as well in order to keep it. I think if they do keep it, it should be a monument-type sign, not a sign on a pole, would involve a masonry base around the sign. Then exterior lighting, we just noted that they would need to provide us with details of the fixtures and demonstrate that they comply with section 34-1035 of the ordinance. They have provided us subsequent to the packet with details of those fixtures. Those can be reviewed for compliance administratively. So I'm comfortable with it being approved. There are conditions necessary as discussed. I've recommended them there. I note that there was a review by the city engineer as well, which should have been in your packet. That I'm happy to answer any questions.
One question I have in regards to the shared parking agreement, that was entered into by previous owners of the building, right? Does that run with the property then?
Yes, it does.
So the new owners have to conform to that?
Correct.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yes. Item number 6, going back to the screen wall, the knee wall.
Yeah.
Okay. What is the stance on that again? Because I'm wondering, are there any of the other buildings that have it?
Yeah, right across the street. Well, I don't know if it's right across the street.
That's-
The Tarakis built theirs, as you know.
Right.
Same
But there's
requirement.
nothing on the Renshaw?
Oh, no,
House of
on this
Optic?
side, no.
Okay.
That's right. So all of this was developed before that was a requirement. And, you know, this, I would analogize this to what we did with the traffic site plan, if you remember that. That was a somewhat similar situation, except that they had the whole north end of that particular strip center. But you required them to have, in their case, a hedge plus an ornamental fence along Main Street. And then on the Jefferson, the actual masonry wall. And they've bonded for that. They haven't built it yet, but they've bonded for it, and it's a requirement of their temporary certificate of occupancy. So we have required it pretty consistently as we've reviewed these site plans. We had a lot of discussion, as you know, about this when the Tarakises were here. And we established that Planning Commission really couldn't do anything about it, right? That they could go to the Zoning Board of Appeals if they wanted, but it's a requirement in the zoning ordinance now for the city center district. And it would be, even if this were rezoned to CMD, which is its intended future zoning district, it's also a requirement for that district. So it's not like they can rezone their way out of it either.
Okay, so your recommendation is still to put that in?
I think you have to condition it on them either providing it or successfully seeking a variance. And that's the way I worded the recommended condition.
Right, okay, I just wanted to help clarify that, because I'm looking at that, and then you've got nothing, then you've got a knee-high wall,
Yeah.
and then you got nothing. I mean,
Right. I mean, that's another thing. I don't know what the motivation for, such improvements to the common areas of the shared parking area would be in any event, but that would be something, in my estimation, that if it were going to be done, it would only make sense for them all to do it. But I mean, they'll explain to you the site constraints better than I can, but I also think it's practically difficult to do it all. And so,
well, I'm kind of siding on with you on that, Greg, because of the fact that,
I only bring it up
Nothing.
because we've consistently required it, and it's required pretty
I
clearly by the ordinance.
oh, I understand, but you have several different business owners in this respect.
Right. Well, not only that, but if you look at the site plan and you see where the property boundaries end,
Right,
there's not a logic to it. There could be a logic to it, between the two islands there along 14 Mile Road, maybe. That would look like it made some sense, but.
because I know it appears that our vision is uniformity and, of course, conformity. Thank you.
So their option is to go to the ZBA and ask for a variance to not put it in.
Correct. which they're gonna have to do
Because of the sign.
for the sign anyway, so
right.
they can save a trip, I guess.
Any other questions?
So as far as the walking the island on the west side, really, that's not an option because that's actually Renshaw's property. Is that,
That's the way I look at it, you know, it would be an off-site improvement.
Yeah.
Now, if they're proposing to do something there, you know, I think that may be another matter, right? And they are proposing to put planter box there, and I really don't think there should be a planter box sitting there.
next to Renshaw? No.
Quite apart from that, you know, in the middle of the parking lot, not protected by any kind of curbing
No,
or
it'd
anything
become
but
an
paint.
it'd become an ashtray. No offense to
Yeah,
anybody, so.
and so, you know, if they want to do something there, then that should also be an island. But because it's off-site, I'm not recommending you require that.
Greg, I have a question. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, perhaps. I'm looking at the application response, and there's the response to questions items 3 and 4. There was also some discussion during a development meeting that this parking lot may undergo some repair after the updates to the 14-mile corridor expected this summer. How does that play into this conversation, or is there any more context that we need to be mindful of?
I think the city engineer may have said something like that. I don't personally recall it. It didn't show up in his report. I don't think there are any, I don't think there's any work that the city's contemplating doing outside of the 14-mile road right-of-way. Jim can correct me if I'm wrong, but
There are portions of this parking lot that are in really bad shape. I think what the engineer was referring to maybe would have been the approaches that we installed, changing the approaches in that area. So.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Anything else? And would the applicant like to?
Good evening, how are you?
Good.
My name is Matt Badrak. I'm with Badrak Design Group, the lead designer on this project. Greg and I have had some conversations here. I see that you've now have the follow-up in your hand in response to, like you had just mentioned, 3 and 4. I will go a little more detail into the site. Well, I guess we'll start with the screen wall since that was something you had discussed there. Along 14 Mile, the difficulty being that there is 10 inches of property from the curb to the property line on one side and 18 inches on the other side. So there's, technically not space for a masonry wall, and definitely not space for landscaping to grow. Additionally, that integral parking curb is actually allowing these parking spaces to be shallower because the continuous curb allows your parking spaces to be only 18 feet as opposed to 20 feet. So now with these being 19 foot, so they're kind of using some of that curb space and the sidewalk space there to allow a drive aisle in front of the building between the parking along 14 Mile and the accessible parking facing the building. So that right now is like a 23-foot 4 drive aisle, so it's a little bit less. So if we go into that screening issue, that becomes, you can see where we dimensionally start to have some issues, especially if we build right on the property line there. So now we're back to like a 20-foot space as opposed to 19-foot, which brings that drive aisle down to 22-foot 4. So that's one of the challenges in that, and we can discuss that with the zoning board for the variance process. I'm just curious, as part of your packet, did you get this this sheet with all the red marking on it? Was this part of the packet?
It was. I didn't print it out in color for them.
Okay. So in that, I've noted the locations they've requested for the sidewalk on the east side of the building, 7 foot. There's definitely plenty of room there. It doesn't interfere with the drive aisle. and then terminating in a landscape island. The question I would have is, does this sidewalk then end at the back of the building, or does it extend further back? That would be a question that I would have.
I would think go into the back of the building, that's
Okay,
it's there to protect the building.
okay. Now, Mr. Jacobson, you had mentioned some concerns on the west side of the building. Again, I think Greg had mentioned that it's kind of not on this property here, but that becomes the same issue as the front of the building. If we do a sidewalk on the side of the building, it reduces that drive aisle significantly because we're already at a 20-foot spot against the wall. So if that situation was required, then it would reduce that drive aisle less than 24 feet, which is the required dimension for a two-way drive aisle. I think we've addressed all of the notes that Greg had in his review. On the drawing, we've also addressed some of the items that Mr. Drinkwine had put in as an engineering review. We've dimensioned the accessible parking spaces up front. In fact, our plan here increases the amount of parking up front there. There's only 2 spaces right now and a mess of parking blocks, and we'll organize that and straighten it up and make it look a lot better. I'm happy to answer any questions that you would have.
So as far as, have you put consideration into what the island would be at the northeast corner? It looks like you may have to take out that one parking spot.
That one actually works real well in that northeast corner. It doesn't affect, you'll notice that I've got some hidden lines in some areas there that look like potential organizations, and they're there for a reason to show that, for compliance for distance of two-way drive aisles. The one on that may or may not be in red on your drawing does make sense. It doesn't interfere with, it doesn't reduce any parking in there, and it does give a nice end to that front facade at least. With that, we haven't identified what kind of landscaping material is going in there, type of trees, but we're certainly receptive to building department's recommendations on trees that are used throughout this district.
Well, I'd recommend against boxwood right up front. I don't know, how much landscaping knowledge, experience do you have?
Not very much when it comes to plantings.
So yeah, if you're looking at a ground cover for a small shrub, I would avoid boxwoods. I would recommend, if you are increasing that spot, there's no overhead wires.
No, they're all at the rear of the building.
Yeah.
So, are we looking, does our ordinance indicate that it has to be a canopy tree, or?
Greg?
Right, are we looking at it being a canopy tree, or what are we looking
Well,
at?
ideally, if that's possible.
Sure.
As you point out, there's nothing overhead that would prevent it.
And do we have, okay, I'm just thinking as far as, what we can put in there, given the limited space, because quite honestly, as far as anything that we put over at the shopping center over here in Clawson, they've not been doing well. They've been dying, given the limited space. And I think that may be due to the fact that, that as far as we should require those types of trees. I don't know if that necessarily works in this location. I certainly would think something that would at least get up to 20 feet, if that's what we're thinking.
Yeah, it's not a street tree, I mean,
Yeah.
the city has street trees along 14 Mile.
Yeah,
So
so I mean, if that's the case, then I would recommend, I have a couple things that I would recommend. I would start off, and do they have to be single stem, or can they be multi-stem?
it can be whatever
Okay,
you
good, all right.
you guys think would work.
Okay, so what I would recommend is it could be multiple or single stem. For that type of spot, I'd recommend a serviceberry, a tree lilac, magnolia, red bud, or a 7 Suns flower. And if you're not familiar with that, you may want to go take a look at one of the islands down at Chris Belli's Pizzeria off of Woodward. Seems like it's the only landscape tree that actually has survived among all the other landscape trees that they have there. And it's a little misbegotten, 4x3 triangle of an area. So I would recommend that. So the other thing, as far as, I think we have some salt tolerance is what you're going to be looking for. So I think city has ground cover as far as salt tolerance, right? Yeah.
Yes.
But as far as, I'm trying to think as far as what else do you want? Who's servicing the snow plow removal? That's shared part of
Part of
the,
the shared parking agreement.
okay.
yes.
All right, where does it tend to go? Do we know? Along the wall or?
Location of where
The
snow gets
snow
pushed.
goes, yeah. That came up in one of the more recent ones, and I think it might be worth considering.
Right, typically it goes against the rear site wall, which is a 6-foot-high formed, like a brick-formed concrete wall.
Okay. All right, then that really, and we hadn't, at one point, I know that we have landscaping in the back, but that's more for Renshaw that they added, which is more for, how should I put it?
They installed a bamboo screen.
Yeah, they put the
wall for their
bamboo back there.
loading dock
Yeah.
/ smoking area.
Yeah, that was to keep people off of the fence, right? So, and there's nothing that we can add, right, as far as, and I was curious whether it was considered as far as any other landscaping along that wall.
We didn't consider that.
Okay.
It's not to say that you can't, but
No, I just, I went back there to take a look at the site. It's one of those things that it's amazing how well what Renshaw put back there is actually done. And I can't remember if it was because it's in a raised planter or if it's actually just in the ground. I think it's because it's a raised planter. And that's why I was just curious as far as whether or not it had been considered as far as that continuing along the back. And if not, I'm okay with the way it
we
is.
kind of looked at the wall as, similar to the situation out front,
Yeah.
right? To do it haphazardly for one site, probably doesn't make sense.
No, I
It's
agree.
not going to be continued.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm good.
Any other questions?
I just so I'm clear in my own head. So the two items that the applicant would be seeking a variance on is the pole sign, as well as, and I'm just forgetting the second piece of it now. The pole sign and knee wall.
Right.
We don't need to think about the mural, other than approving a mural, right? And the wall sign is not part of the equation. I'm just trying to track all the different pieces that we need to consider.
I don't think they're proposing a wall sign.
Okay, I just
Correct
wanna
me
make
if
sure
I'm
that
wrong. I
that's
think
what
they're
where we
proposing
were
to
on that.
trade that for the freestanding sign.
So if it turns out that they do not get the variance for the existing sign,
They could do a wall sign by right.
okay.
You're supposed to review it because it's
That's
city
my
center
point.
district.
Yeah, do they need to come back in front of us, and what does that do as far as the site plan itself?
You could give administration the authority to
Okay.
review it.
Okay. I'm just thinking, yeah, it's good as far as
Right.
what the ZBA may or may not do. We're not that body.
I don't see it mentioned anywhere, but I'm assuming that you're also gonna fix up the parking lot, right? Where the potholes and where the issues are toward.
Well,
Airport.
I think the way it works is that that's supposed to be a collective effort, right, of this whole group. And there are mechanisms for any given member to, and the city attorney's here, he maybe recalls better than I what that agreement says in that regard, but there are mechanisms for any one of the members to initiate that and to cause it to happen, and then the group funds it jointly.
So the whole thing needs to be done,
Well,
or they need to all put into a pot and.
whatever they do is supposed to be done collectively, because it's all shared, right? All the parking as you can see on the drawing that's attached, everything that's hatched is common. And it's share and share alike in terms of its maintenance, according to a formula that is included in the agreement.
So how do we make sure that that gets done?
I suppose you could condition the approval on them taking the necessary steps as members of that group to make sure that the necessary repairs are accomplished, at least within the boundaries of their site.
I mean, that's not the worst part of that shared parking lot, but there are definite issues in front of that building.
You're talking about in front of Renshaw?
No, the Old Port's the worst.
Oh, really? I
Oh,
was
yeah.
thinking the Lake Superior that's in front of Renshaw.
Oh, that made me
Yeah.
think of that. I haven't been there. But yeah, I think Old Port, it's worse, but as you're crossing the property line to get to
Yeah.
Old Port, that's not good either. So it'd be a shame to do so much work on this building and then have that parking lot exist the way it is.
Members of the Planning Commission, John King, Sub-City Attorney. I was involved in the negotiation of that SPA agreement many years back, and at the time, the design and the intention was that cooperatively, the owners would work to keep the premises improved. From a practical standpoint, that has not existed, but then again, I have not been called upon to meet with them to try to encourage them. It is their own site, and the intention was that they get together and do it. Certainly, the city can intervene at some point in time, but it is a responsibility of the owners. I think it would be a burden on this applicant, who's new to the site, to say, we're going to condition the approval upon you doing something. I think what is stronger is the fact that you have an acknowledgement that there is a problem with that shared parking agreement, and that you may want to instruct administration, the city attorney, to initiate whatever process is deemed appropriate to meet with those owners and figure out the game plan and then report back to you. But I would not condition that on this applicant because they're new to the site. They don't have any connection with it. I do, not saying it's good, but certainly I drafted it and I have knowledge about what the purpose was. And this might be appropriate. I mean, as you've mentioned, and I can use you as an example, I can tell the group that it was my assumption based on this particular application that you were extremely disturbed about the appearance of that site in the city center. And it's a detraction. And that you were in a quandary as to how something ought to be done. And so collectively you thought maybe the city attorney ought to be directed to get involved. That message can have some resonance among the other members. And that's what you're trying to do here, is to get them to be aware of the situation. That's only one. Parking has been an issue because the businesses have been primarily very successful. And I will say that we've had continuing informal discussions with two of the owners regarding the acquisition of property in the back that could conceivably be used for parking. However, I think there is an issue regarding that being in the city center and parking lots not allowed. But I think also the rule of reason ought to come into play here because additional parking is necessary and you cannot expand it on that site. So those discussions have occurred. I don't know what the action is. It's been taken by the two people whom I know are involved in that. But that could be another aspect of this informally if you direct me to work on the parking issues.
So you're talking the property to the south, that there's, how far does this extend as far as potential parking?
I can't tell you.
Okay. And is
I'm
that currently?
not totally privy, but I know there are discussions.
And is that potential parking area actually in the city center, or is that in a different zone?
I heard it was in the city center, and there are some prohibitions on that.
Okay.
But then again, I'm sure the persuasive art of some people might be able to achieve a different viewpoint.
And the other question I had was there ever a resolution to the status of ownership of the Old Port, not Old Port again?
You know, that is a myriad of adventures. And I have been connected with many of those adventures. And the latest one, I was led to believe that there is some relative stability that exists now, and that things are taken care of. Now, that I received several months ago, so I cannot, that was my information several months ago.
Okay. I was just curious if we missed an opportunity in those situations to address the parking lot.
You could say that you did, but again, you know, it's not, and this is not a cop-out, it's just, it's not my function
Sure.
to direct others to say, okay, gotta do this.
Okay.
To the extent that I can influence the owners by being one of the craftsmen of that shared parking agreement, I'd be happy to do so.
Okay. All right.
This is, I apologize on this one. I think this might be more of a thought exercise, but I'm kind of curious, a thought experiment here. So if we apply the pressure in some degree to get the parking lot repair fixed, and the SPA comes back with a proposal to resurface the lot, does that reopen or open a knee wall conversation? And then where would we be then?
Well, you know, I still think it's an issue of each site having to go through site plan review, and sort of a wicked problem in that none of them will go, they won't all go through at the same time, right? It might argue for deferral, right, as opposed to an actual variance as a solution, right? Assuming that what Matt says is not so, that it's just practically not viable to build one in that location, which I think may be so.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it may be that there's not space enough dimensionally to accomplish it. But otherwise, you know, what you would tend to want to do then is to just put it off as opposed to waive it, right? You know, when we amended the, with all the various iterations of Old Port, the fact that we had amended the site plan review requirements of the city center district to require it when property owner changed as opposed to business owner changed, you prevented that from going through site plan review in any of those iterations, or that might have been before you last year as well, or even this year.
So as far as
George, wait. I think it got a little bit more complicated. When you patch, mill, and resurface a parking lot, it does not come back for site plan review. If you construct a new parking lot, then they would have to have the knee wall, the landscape requirements, and everything like that. So right now, that's our current policy. We actually will be talking about it later in this meeting.
Okay, thank you.
So then I'll continue your thought exercise. So are we potentially getting a situation where we have them go to the ZBA, they get the variance, and then something happens to the Old Port? Well, now, guess what? We have them having a requirement to put in some type of knee wall, facade, shrubbery, fence. And now we've got, and same thing with Renshaw. So now we've got two fences and nothing in the middle because they got their ZBA.
Well, yeah, potentially. I mean, it's the link of the chain theory, right?
Yeah.
You know, like you see sidewalks along, you know, communities that have a requirement to put in your piece of public sidewalk, right?
Yep.
Often you'll see a sidewalk sitting there that doesn't go anywhere for a while until the next site down the road redevelops, and then it connects. So yes, there is that potential, and that's an issue. Again, You know, I guess what would be appropriate now, and it's not necessarily for the planning commission to determine, because you can't waive it in any event, but for the zoning board of appeals to be convinced that there should not be a knee wall or a hedge and screen, I think they have to be convinced that dimensionally it can't work, as has been suggested.
But that's just specific for his site. It could be that the way that the property is aligned, that it could be for Old Port, right?
It could be, but again,
Yeah.
if it's not possible to build it in front of this site,
Yeah.
because of the distance between the building, and I don't, you know, parking situation being what it is here, I don't assume that losing parking is an option, right?
Yeah.
And so if the dimensions between face of building and the depth of parking and the required aisle width are such that that you can't add to it the width necessary to legitimately create a knee wall in front of this site, and I think you figured out that you're gonna have a gap there.
Okay, so as far as the parking in the front, it's not in non-compliance now, it's in compliance, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that we could have relied on the fact that there's not enough space in between as it is, and you couldn't put it there anyway and say that hang our hat on the fact that,
Well, the answer to this might be knowable, because I think Matt's gone through those dimensions, so maybe he can describe for us what.
Yeah, in fact, the site gets, the distance from the curb to the property line gets greater as you go towards like Bigby. So there's 2 feet of space there.
okay,
Old Port, negative space.
okay.
So that's where it all, like, comes into play there. So it's this inconsistency there.
But as far as the space between parking spots, you're within allowable distance and not in,
Here to here.
This distance here, the parking.
So he's already at a 22-foot aisle there, right? As he says, his spaces along 14 Mile are only 19 feet, 2 inches deep.
okay.
His spaces in front of the building, which are allowed to overhang, are 18, so they're conforming. But he's short in his distance from the right-of-way to the spaces in front of the building already.
So as far as parking as it exists now, it prevents him from putting in that knee wall?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So under those circumstances, he doesn't. Sorry.
Sitting back there and being reflective, which at my age is difficult to do, I was thinking about the fact we have some planning issues that deal with this particular site. And they say they can be common to one another as future developments, to existing business and as future developments come in. So it'd be my thought that if we're going to talk to the owners about the parking lot, it might be wise for the planner and myself to start talking about the variations that present restrictions apply in that site and the practicability of them or the application of them, and figure out some way in which to coordinate an amendment to the shared parking agreement that minimizes any issues in the future regarding businesses that move in there. And then try to get any ordinance changes that might allow for that particular exception to occur. The circumstance of that site is unique in and of itself. There's no similar site in the city, and so it has its own problems. And so maybe it's time for Greg and I to sit down, develop the plan, and then meet with the owners and say, okay, what do you think about this? So just a thought.
Throwing one other wrinkle out there, since it is part of the city center, and since we did have a review with a new building, which used to be Dunkin' Donuts, at one point in time, it was required that that had to be up to the sidewalk.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do they have to also go for a variance for that? Or are we saying that's,
No, they're not building a building.
no, I know, that's what I'm saying, as far as the, yeah, okay. So
It's a
the fact that-
non-conforming building.
Okay,
but
so that, yeah, okay.
they're not altering it.
Hey, when are you looking to open up business?
Probably July, August.
July or August.
You know, as long as we get, you know, approval, kind of slow stuff up a little bit, but we're aiming for July or August.
Okay. very
When
good.
do you have to be out of your current location?
I have until September. We've been there 20 years. And so we're just moving 5 blocks down. And they just wouldn't renew our lease. He didn't want to go out any further. I wanted another 10 years. He didn't want to go any further, so we saw this building and we approached the city and they pretty much said they were very.
Oh,
they-
you need a microphone, sorry.
Okay.
I got it,
You
Mamish.
know, the city, I approached them before I bought the building, and the city was all for me staying in Clawson because we could have moved to Royal Oak or Troy or something, you know, close. We wanted to stay close. And seems like it's been a little bit of a rough road, but we're just doing the best we can, and we just want to open up this summer, and it's going to be a first-class optical company and pull in that according type of people. You know, we're not a 2 for $49 pair or anything like that. So we're anxious to get going, and we're doing the best we can. You know, we just got to get approval, and that's where we're at. But we don't object too much to what's been suggested, as long as it's affordable for us. Like you said, if too much is dumped on us, it would probably pose a problem because we're a small business. We only have one company. So, but we've already patched the parking lot in front there, and we have no problem improving that, patching it and improving it. I mean, we would do that on our own without being asked. We don't need any help from the city. You know, we want it to look good. You know, it's a good-looking building. So it's where we're at, July, August.
So the mural, we kind of touched on it, but it's going to be the same mural, right?
Yeah, it's going to be the same. We're just going to change a couple of the characters
Okay.
so they're a little more recognizable, and that's kind of been our thing, that mural. It's been there 20 years, so this one will be very nice. Everything we're going to do is going to be top-notch there. You know, the inside, everything. It's a very good-looking building. That's why we purchased it.
Okay.
So,
So in looking to approve the site plan, we're not going to make it contingent on the fact that they have to get the variance from the ZBA, correct? I mean, they're,
It's either or. They either have to comply or succeed in getting the variance.
so we give them the option of either or, but, you know, that's not going to be holding them up. I mean, they're not going to have to, you know.
No, I wrote these so that they could move forward. You should add number 5, that the concrete work will require engineering approval as well, but site concrete work. But yeah, I wrote them so that they can move forward one way or the other.
Any other questions?
So again, it's as far as ZBA, it will need to be for the wall,
Right.
and it will need to be for the sign.
Correct.
Okay. All right. I'll make a motion that we approve site plan for 250 East 14 Mile with the following conditions. First, the 7-foot wide walk along the east side of the building, terminating in a landscaped island at the northeast corner of the building shall be provided. The island shall contain salt-tolerant ground cover or shrubs and one single specimen of a hardy tree, recommendation of magnolia, serviceberry, redbud, seven suns, tree lilac, not to be, but excluding crabapple and Callery pear. let's see, and then that those are subject to the approval by the Building and Planning Department. 2, the required parking lot screening along 14 miles shall be provided unless a variance is obtained. 3, the proposed pole sign shall be deleted unless a variance is obtained. 4, exterior lighting shall be shown to comply with the LDR Section 34-1035, and detail of exterior lighting fixtures shall be provided on the site plan. 5, concrete work will require engineering approval. And as far as recommendation or direction to City Council, should that be part of this, or?
I would make it a separate. Yeah, right, thanks.
Separate motion.
I'd make it a separate motion, and we can jointly help you phrase it.
Okay, thank you.
So the essence gets heard.
Then I'll support that.
I have a motion, and I have support. Anybody want to change anything, add to it, delete anything? Everybody's happy? Roll call, please.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Adia?
Yes.
Mr. McHale?
Yes.
Ms. Prowse?
Yes.
Mr. Shepherd?
Yes.
Mr. Kucera?
Yes.
Ms. Fenton?
Yes.
Welcome to Clawson.
Thank you very much.
Or moving in Clawson, I should say.
Lovely place.
Thank you. Agenda item number 6 is a discussion of proposed amendments to the land development regulations, including the definition of home occupation and administrative site plan review for facade improvements and parking lot reconstruction. Mr. King, step on.
That's fine.
Home occupation, the group worked on that ordinance, and when I got the packet Friday, Saturday, I looked at it and at the proposed ordinance, and it appeared to me that we might have had some problems in connection with the clarification of what the enforcement provisions can be. So I prepared a memo and I've handed it to you, and I thought it would be in your supplemental packet, but apparently it wasn't for whatever reason. And we use a definition of nuisance that's in the ordinance. And the items regarding the requirements for a home occupation are in that ordinance, so those are untouched. But with a variety of differences that may come about in this day and age with electronic retailing out of a home and maybe distribution, just as examples, we thought that maybe we ought to expand, or I did, maybe I ought to expand that by referring to the building official's rights under Chapter 42, which are a variety, because he's got to have the discretion to figure out where there are violations based on his interpretation of the definition and the facts supporting that definition. So he has the latitude to either give warnings, he can issue a civil infraction, he can issue a misdemeanor, he can have a manager hearing, and those are all available to him under Chapter 42. So I wanted to add the language of subparagraph 5 for consideration in that regard. And that gives the building official the latitude to do whatever he wants to based on the circumstances, which he ought to have, I think, in this instance. So that's the observation that I have on this. The council did ask about that the other night, and I indicated that this was in the Land Development Code, and therefore you were going to have a chance to look at it at this meeting and do whatever you want to do as far as recommendation changes beyond what we've proposed to you.
So, as John mentioned, this came up in the context of looking at massage registration, and council raised the question, well, could that be a home occupation? And as it's worded Currently, the implication would be that it cannot, because we allow it, if at all, under the ordinance, by analogy to other personal services like barbershops, beauty salons. And those are currently, under the current definition of a home occupation, expressly excluded. So we all met, city clerk, city attorney, the building department, myself. Was that last Thursday? Wednesday? Maybe Wednesday. 2 weeks ago, Wednesday, to go through the language of the current ordinance and all these ordinances that have been before council and come up with proposed alternate language. So we had come up, we actually tried to just greatly simplify the definition of home occupation, which was what was distributed in your packet that came out of that meeting. And then, as John says, he had a thought about a fifth paragraph that he'd like to add as well. The process going forward, then, if you're interested in doing this, is for you to direct us to set up a public hearing on it at some point in the future. Now, we tend to want to do as much as we can when we get into amending the zoning ordinance, because it's sort of a cumbersome process. And Jim had some ideas of other things that he would like to address, which I mentioned in the agenda item. I guess I would note that with respect to therapeutic massage, which was the subject of the registration ordinance that council is working on, I think it's through first reading. John has had first reading before council. It's worth noting that while there's a definition of therapeutic massage in the zoning ordinance right now, there isn't anywhere where it's expressly permitted, as I say. It's kind of permitted by analogy, where other kind of personal services are permitted. So that is also something that we might want to clarify if we're going to work on this through a set of ordinance amendments. But Jim, do you want to talk about the other couple ideas, or you want me to talk about them?
I can give you my thoughts on them.
Sure.
So. In regard to administrative site plan review for facade improvements, section 34-611 outlines those. And then it has major facade changes, including but not limited to the following, shall be subject to full site plan review and approval by the planning commission. Installation of a new window and door openings where they weren't previously existing. So somebody wants to put in a $500 window or a $1,000 window, they have to go through full site plan review. I thought that was kind of excessive, part of the ordinance. Remodeling upper story facades, so that would be the exterior of the building. We've had situations where the facades were looking to be altered and told them they had to go through site plan review in front of the planning commission before they could improve their buildings, so their buildings didn't go improved. Installation of new awnings, change of exterior building materials, other changes not noted above that would alter the appearance of the entire building. We've had buildings that went from a earth tone color to a bright red color, which I consider altering the exterior of the building. But then we have also in the administrative review, cleaning, painting, and repairing doesn't come in front of you guys. So there's a little conflict there. When this ordinance was written, this part of it, we were dealing with the downtown district. And we were very concerned about the exteriors of the buildings and how they looked and improving them from their original look to now. So they took a lot of power out of the building part of it and put it into the planning commission's jurisdiction. It's my interpretation now that maybe we should bring some of it back in from a common sense point of view, back to the building department and not make people go through as many site plan review processes in front of you guys. That's my opinion on the facade improvements. And the parking lot improvements, like I had said earlier, there's part of the ordinance says that any construction requires site plan review. And we considered constructing a parking lot, whether it's removing and rebuilding or constructing a brand-new one, construction. So the patching, repairing, or milling off the surface and putting back 2 inches of asphalt was not considered construction. That was repair and maintenance. We've got a couple of situations where parking lots need to be completely removed in areas and rebuilt. Some of them have the existing landscaping requirements. Some of them don't have the landscaping and curbing requirements. We were thinking about the engineer having a first look at it to determine whether it has to go through site plan review or not, even if it reaches the construction phase of a parking lot. There is some areas of the city, like I said, that multiple areas there, different parking lots meet every requirement we have, but we'd still have to send them through site plan review. And then there's other parking lots that don't meet all of our requirements that we'd have to send through site plan review on our construction. But then every time we send a existing parking lot that doesn't have landscaping or curbing or decorative, they always complain because they're losing parking. And parking seems to be a hot issue in the city right now. So just different ideas that I wanted you guys to consider looking at when we go through changing our ordinances and the land development regulations. They're all your jurisdiction. And right now, it's you have the engineer's opinion on the parking lots and my opinion on facade changes. So you can go back to home occupations now or expand onto that. So
When this comes up, you mentioned it comes up for public comment. Does that come on public comment in front of us on the planning or in front of the city council?
No, you conduct the public hearing on any amendments to the zoning ordinance. It will ultimately go to council at a public meeting, but the official public hearing takes place here.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, do you want to proceed with this now? Do you want us to, are there other things that you as a commission are thinking about that need to be addressed that you wish we would address now as we're going to get into doing some amendments to the zoning ordinance? Do you want to include the things that Jim has talked about, some proposed language in that regard to lessen what is considered a major facade improvement, for example? I'll give you a concrete example of that one. We all went down and looked at a building that is a non-conforming building that sits in the middle of, kind of like, looks like it's sitting in the middle of the parking lot of an apartment complex on Rochester Road. It was a mechanical contractor, now is an electrician, or vice versa?
It was plumbing, and now it's electrical.
Right, so,
Or heating and cooling, sorry, you're right.
you know, and so he'd like to make, it's kind of a worn out building. He would like to make it look a little bit better. He would like to put in a window on the one side of the building to improve its appearance. Under the code as it's written, that he'd have to go through site plan review to do that. And maybe you want him to. Maybe you think that would be appropriate. But I think that, I mean, is an example of what Jim's talking about. You know, are there things that we'd like folks to do and not put too high a hurdle in front of them, you know, in terms of improving existing properties. On the other hand, you know, you sometimes miss an opportunity to get things done if you don't go through site plan review, as as tonight might have been an example of.
And as we discuss, or missed opportunities to preserve some things. You know, one thing that comes to mind is the, was it the Grammar House across from the funeral home? That the property was sold and it was clear cut. Everything was there. And now it sits as a blank piece of nondescript, non-enhancing property that nothing's happened to. So I guess I'd like to see what we can look at as far as tree preservation, so that opportunity doesn't come where we just, okay, we're just gonna cut everything down. How that gets incorporated, I don't know. I mean, there's other tree ordinances in the surrounding areas we could take a look at. But it's just a shame we're getting to that point where we've got a lot of older trees, and I've brought this up, I know everybody hears me all the time about it. All right, but it's one of those things that there's another house where they've clear cut again, and it's one of those, I'd like to see it addressed. You know, we had 80% of that property covered with the trees, and now there's nothing there, and we're doing the same with some other properties.
Yeah.
That tends to get done outside of zoning ordinances in most cases. In my experience, natural features ordinances are a separate police power ordinance. That's the way most folks do it.
Well, I guess, I know for, who was it? Auburn Hills. They have a 1-for-1. And I'm not looking for the 1-for-1, but when they have a new development, anything that's taken down, they either fund into a tree fund or a bank, and then that's part of what they have for new site approval, right? And I guess I'd like to see consideration for that, how that might work here. Anyway, that's what I'd like to see.
It's a difficult problem, as Jim was explaining. If we allow administration to make these decisions and not bring the people in front of us on planning, a lot of things aren't going to get fixed around town. It's going to fall by the wayside. A guy could ask for the permit to paint his building. So if he paints his building, fine, that's all he's going to do. But if it needs a parking lot, it needs other things done, then rather than say, okay, paint your building, then come in and have a site plan. Well, that can be very expensive, and the guy's not going to do that. So we're trying to tread a little line here someplace. I'd like to find some way that the businesses can improve what they have going without having to go through the entire site plan. But it's a fine line as to where we draw that.
I'm curious if there's, maybe it's somewhat anecdotal on your side, Jim, or Greg, for some of these conversations, if there's something to be considered around the geographic component. So if city centers, perhaps maybe we as a body want to treat that differently, as opposed to something in some of the other geographies across the city where it may be on Rochester Road and they just want to fix up a window. And I'm just wondering if there's a geographic component that we may want to think about as it pertains to at least the zoning ordinances.
Yeah, well, you have design criteria in certain zoning districts and you don't have them in others, for example, right? I think city center, when we do it, the central mixed district, I think Westgate has design criteria in it. Where you have some, if you're talking about the architecture, where you have some rules to follow in terms of reviewing it, like you do in those places, then it makes sense for those properties in those districts to come before you and be reviewed against those rules. If you don't really have any, like the building on Rochester Road, he comes in and he's got a window. You like the window or you don't like the window, but you don't have any criteria in your ordinance that tell you this window's okay, this window's not okay. It kind of begs the question, well, what's the point of reviewing it then if you don't have any standards that apply to it? So I think that might be an answer to your question. It might, at least as far as the architectural items are concerned, it might make sense to require that review where you have adopted standards for it and let up on it where you haven't, seems to me.
Well, wouldn't that be just like any other engineering changes, just like automotive or buildings or anything like that, where you want to make a change, it would be proposed. In other words, the business owner would present it to administration, for instance, and then let them know first, because part of that is, which we've noticed, is the communication. We definitely need that. And so if Jim is aware of what they're proposing, we would definitely have to have certain guidelines on that, because just to put a window or a door in, are we putting the structure at risk as far as load bearings, things like that, too?
Well, it's,
Form or
yeah,
function?
they're gonna get a building permit for sure.
Yeah.
That, the construction permits are not a question. The question is really one of design. So, for example, we had the building down on South Main, the office building, where they had proposed awnings, right? And then they didn't put the awnings on, right? And they came back to you with a drawing that didn't have awnings on it. And there was really nothing you could say it, but yes, at that point, because there's nothing in the zoning ordinance that required that building to have awnings.
But if, let's say I had an older building in town here, it's in bad shape, I could come into the building department and get a permit to paint it, correct?
You don't need a building permit to paint it.
You don't, yeah, you don't need a
Okay,
permit to
if,
paint, so you,
if I need a new roof, I can get a permit to re-roof
correct.
the place. And is that gonna open me up for other problems? Let's say while you're there looking at my roof, you can see that my parking lot's in bad repair.
Not at this point in time. We had somebody that said they were gonna put a new roof on, and it was actually siding material. The roof went down as a mansard roof along the side, so it was, they were altering the roof, or the facade of the building. So that tripped them up there. They were painting, altering the facade of their building. And there was something else that they were doing, and it triggered the site plan review. And we ended up, when we had the meeting with them and telling them that, they chose not to do anything with the building.
So you could do some items. You could re-roof if it's done correctly, you could repaint if it's done correctly, make improvements without triggering an overall look at it.
Correct. There is some items.
That's the fine line I'm trying to figure out how to tread there.
Yeah, there used to be an ordinance that you couldn't paint the building in the city center district
Yeah.
without going through site plan review. And I believe that was changed in this last version of the city center ordinance, so.
Okay, any further discussion?
So are we, I mean, I don't have any problem with staff making some recommendations of ways that you think we might want to adjust that and bring it back for us to take a look at and discuss, like to have something actually in front of us to say whether or not we think it's appropriate or not. I don't have any problem with that.
This is like a first step for me, and my interpretation of land development, chapter 34. There is multiple sections in that chapter that need to be addressed. I'm just trying to knock the immediate problem off, and then we'll bring the rest of it. And I think we need your direction to allow us to alter the ordinance. Correct, Greg? They have to direct us to alter the ordinances?
Either council or planning commission can initiate amendments to the zoning ordinance. I asked city attorney, he didn't feel like there was a great urgency to amending the home occupation definition. It's something we want to do, but, I don't think we have to rush into setting a public hearing now on that. We can bring back to you for more study and discussion, a group of proposed amendments, including that, then we can work on going forward and including some of the things that Jim brought up.
Sounds like a plan, so moved.
Not anxious to get home.
Before we move on, we should throw, I don't know if we need a motion in here to direct our city attorney to resolve the shared parking agreement. Are you going to need a motion, or you just need recommendation?
I think you need a motion, because I'm going to get him involved too.
Okay.
So I think the motion should basically be along the lines that you're directing the planner for the city and the city attorney to develop a plan dealing with site plan review issues or improvements on the shared parking agreement, dealing with parking issues and other related issues regarding the businesses under that shared parking agreement, and to make the appropriate report back to the Planning Commission in a reasonable period of time.
Before we make a motion on that, actually, I have one quick question for clarification. John, you may have the best knowledge on this. Do we have any more of these shared parking agreements across the city?
No, that's
Is this,
the only one.
This is the only one, okay.
But there are other areas that could have it
Thank you.
along Rochester Road.
May I make a friendly amendment to your suggestion?
You can do anything you want.
I believe my economic development coordinator should be part of that because she has the business perspective on that, and
Fine.
she has some, so she should be part of those meetings also.
Okay.
Got it? Make one?
Yeah, I had already had some notes down and I ran out of space, so you have to.
She might have already captured
And
it.
as I make the motion. All right, so I'd like to make a motion that we direct city planner, economic development coordinator, and city attorney to gather all parties of interest for the shared parking agreement that includes 250 East 14 Mile and adjacent properties for that shared parking agreement to gather in order to remedy the situation with a plan to resolve parking issues and other building issues resulting from the shared
Strike
parking.
remedy. All we're doing is coming up with issues, plans, and then it's in your hands.
So stricken with those amendments.
They'll talk and they'll come back to us.
They'll talk and we will hear their report in
A reasonable period of time.
an appropriate fashion.
I have a motion.
Support.
And I have support. Roll call, please.
Mr. Adia,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Ms. Prowse,
Yes.
Mr. Shepherd,
Yes.
Mr. Kucera,
Yes.
Ms. Fenton,
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson.
Yes.
Motion passed. Agenda item number 7, public discussion, items not on the agenda. Mr. Public.
Chairperson, members of the Planning Commission. The last meeting, the City Council heard first reading, or had up for first reading, the massage ordinance. I explained to them the background, the changes that we made, and why we did them. And so that was adopted on a first reading without any amendment to the document we proposed to them. The food ordinance document came up, and in that regard, there was a singular observation made about the fact that we exempted veterans from applying for any license. So the question arose, what about Clawson residents? I indicated that that can be a dicey issue because you need a justification from a constitutional standpoint to allow a resident to have that exemption, as opposed to me, who lives in Royal Oak and I want to come in. Why don't I get it too? So over the weekend, when my mind was fecund, which is very rare, I sat down and developed a text and a language that sort of justified why a Clawson resident ought to have such an exemption. And that will be presented to them at the next council meeting.
I'm sorry to interrupt. An exemption for what license of
Clawson
vending?
residents,
Yeah, a license for what?
food trucks,
Why would-
application.
A fee
Clarification, I thought when we were discussing the food truck ordinance and, since we also discussed this at the same time when we did a few weeks ago, we discussed exempting veterans from paying the fee, but not necessarily exempting them from applying
That's
for.
the fee, right.
Okay.
Right.
It's not.
And now the question is Clawson residents being exempt. And that's a dicey issue. But I developed a justification for that under limited circumstances, and we'll see how it flies.
Can you say more about it here, or do we have to attend the session?
No, I
in
don't want to
person?
say more about it here. I don't want to take away the surprise from a reaction that the council may have. The other thing was the special events. And there was a legitimate observation on special events. In one of the paragraphs that shows the statement and purpose, it seems to be mandatory that all the criteria below that are listed, and there may be 15, have to be met. And the question was raised, when you have events like the 4th of July or some other event that develops a tremendous number of people, how can you possibly achieve that mandatory requirement? And it was a legitimate observation. So what I did was I struck the language of that statement and developed a preamble as to the purpose and rationale for it, and then allowed for some latitude on flexibility regarding those requirements under it. Because the observation was very legitimate as it related to the 4th of July. I mean, they'd have to apply, possibly comply with all that, and it's impossible for them to do so when you're looking at traffic. I mean, they have no control over the traffic, and they can't even regulate or develop a scheme for it because it's so mammoth. So that will be presented to them at the next meeting as well, and we'll see how that goes. So that was how we handled that, was just by adding some more flexibility under the standard. And that's all I have to report.
Thank you. Anyone else from public? Seeing none, I'll close public discussion right now, and we'll move on to number 8, other business.
I have things.
Okay, Susie.
First and foremost, I'd like to introduce you all to our newest planning commissioner, Darren Audia. Please be nice to him. Darren's a pretty fantastic guy. I've worked with him before. So, welcome, Darren.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome on board.
Happy to be here.
Let's see. Now, on to other interesting things. A joint meeting. I'm sure you all got the email requesting for your preferred date for our next joint meeting. The winning date, which you will get official notification later this week from Mike, the official date will be Tuesday, May 29th at 7 p.m. There are no agenda items at this moment that I am aware of, but we will have that for you in advance of the meeting. Also, Mike has sent out, you should have all received an email with your new City of Clawson email and instructions for setting up your own password and whatnot. So if you've not gotten that email, Darren, you'll get one. You can let myself know, you can let Victoria know, and we'll get that squared away. Let's see. Jim and I met with the Pastor Bob of Church of Clawson last week to touch base about where exactly their plans are, since an initial review was done at the end of last year. So they will be submitting their revised plans to us hopefully this week, and with the intent of coming to you either at the end of May, at your second meeting in May, or in June. We talked with Bob about phasing the project, because it's been a challenge for them for several years now to have enough funds to make the necessary improvements. So right now their idea is to do some of the landscaping on site and focus on doing the the Main Street facade. And then we will get a more definitive timeline, for the remaining improvements to the site. The city did get the DNR tree grant. And there's a significant amount of right-of-way there. So there will be 6 trees planted as part of that grant in front of the church.
So they'll be coming in front of us for a site plan approval with timelines involved?
Yes, and we made it very clear to him. He's
Very
going to have
similar to
to.
what I was saying earlier. Let's try not to force everything down their throat at one time. If there's any way we can spread this thing out, it might be easier.
Right, and they, we strongly suggested to Bob that they do what you have required Mike Savoy to do, which is come back every so often
To fill us
and
in.
provide you with an update so you know exactly where they're at, what kind of hangups they may or may not be having. I refuse to give up on the possibility that we can work out some sort of shared parking arrangement with them. It's been a discussion that we've been having for well over a year to try and find the best way to make that happen.
And who
So
would they share with?
it would be ideally a share with the city, right? There's a need for public parking. There is significant parking pressures from Woodpile. There's, potential, the Walper. Well, I don't believe the container project is going to happen with Walper at this exact moment. That is, it is a possibility though, right? I mean, that is an option for development that even if they didn't want to do containers, maybe they did want to do some multifamily, the pressures for parking would still exist. There is also, I believe there will be someday, I don't know when, someday the bump shop will get redeveloped. There are parking constraints at that site as well. So, I mean, there's clearly a need for the city to work to address parking pressures and identify solutions for them. So I refuse to give up on that one. So, and in all the conversations that we've had with Bob, I mean, he's been a great community partner. He wants to continue to be a great community partner. So I think our conversations will continue to be positive in that regard. Another plan you can expect probably closer to June, maybe even July, is hopefully June, is the Weiss Distilling Company. They got their liquor license approval at the last council meeting. They purchased the former 24G building and Great Sport Coffee, and they will be opening a distillery with a small tasting room and some retail space. So their plans do call for demolishing the Great Sport building and building a new one to complement the 24G building. So I expect all of that work to be coming to us soon. Let's see, what else do we have? I think that's it for right now.
You have anything, Jim?
Yes, the Clawson Corners sign has been lowered and redone. I didn't even realize it until Mr. Band gave me a call today. So I went over and did an inspection over there. They have put in their handicap parking signs as I requested. So that project's moving along quite well. And they altered the electric service, which wasn't part of the site plan, but it was hit by a truck or something.
Trees are ordered and scheduled to go in.
Yes. At Dario, we had them up and operating last year with their outdoor patio. They have installed the landscaping at the back part of the property that we asked for last year. So they had missed the planting windows. So that's what happened.
What was the address? I'm sorry.
The Dario.
Dario.
Okay.
On South
Oh, yeah,
Main.
you showed me the pictures. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board members were looking into gazebos. At Costco, they have these 14 by 12 wooden gazebos, small ones, fairly cheap construction. And they wanted permission to look at, or ask the planning commission if they could start installing these on city property. From my memory, when we put in the skate park and the baseball diamonds, we looked through the ordinance, and it was determined that any structures going on city property falls under the jurisdiction of the planning commission. They're just speculating right now, and since these are smaller projects, if they get permission to do it, do they have to go through full site plan review? Or can they just say, I want to put it in this park and we're thinking about this area or that area? And do they have to run it in front of the planning commission or not? I didn't have a solid answer for them, but I knew that when you start installing structures on
Yeah.
city-owned property, that you guys got to give a nod to
I
it.
think they would have to come in front of us for doing something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a
So-
concrete base too, doesn't it?
It would be a concrete base, concrete patio that they'd pour around it and then assemble these small gazebos up. And they're just looking for shelter areas. I can show you the picture. I didn't make copies of it, but they're looking at ways of, if they can get small donations, making improvements to the parks.
You're looking at the parks or the parking lots?
The parks, these
The
would be
parks, okay.
gazebos for picnic tables and stuff like that.
Huh, okay.
So just for clarification, Jim, sorry, so gazebos being different than picnic tables, I'm kind of curious how they're identifying the priority. Can you say anything about that? Like, if they're going to raise funds for something, how does it speak to a broader plan, I suppose?
I think they saw them at Costco and thought that would be a neat idea to have at the parks right now. That's as far as the
As
plan
far as
has
it went?
gotten.
Were they half off?
Much like how the skate park got
For
started.
Costco,
They're less than $2,000, and
That's not bad.
pretty good-looking things.
yeah.
They're not really gazebos. They're
Shelters,
Pavilions.
I don't know what. they are.
gazebos are the round.
Yeah.
I wonder how the
Walls. Those don't
DPW
have any
guys would
walls.
feel about that.
Maintaining it?
Yeah, it's more maintenance.
Anyway.
Well, this price doesn't include concrete, though.
No, no.
They don't need a rat wall, do they?
Not if they don't have walls, no.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Anything else, Jim?
No, I think that's it for tonight.
If that's all, I have a question. Someone can correct me, but was there not a change to liquor sales and a half-mile requirement? Has that been removed? And how does that impact? No? Okay.
We'll check it out.
Okay. My concern is the city center. Now, when that's been removed, how does that impact us? Okay. All right, appreciate it.
Anything else? Anything down here? Nothing? Motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Motion, support, roll call, please.
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Shepherd?
Yes.
Mr. Kucera?
Yes.
Ms. Fenton?
Yes.
Mr. Jacobson?
Yes.
Mr. Audio?
Yes. Thank you, everyone.